Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar with focus on PCI DSS 4.0. Let's get started, the name of the topic. And as you can guess, we only have about 45-50 minutes for our presentation. We cannot cover everything that came up with the release of PCI 4.0. But we want to give you an overview of the most relevant changes, new requirements, and everything that you need to consider in preparation for your first PCI DSS 4.0 assessment. But before we get started, I would like to start with a short introduction and give you some additional and general feedback on the webinar and how we would like to proceed within the next hour. I already saw some familiar names that registered for this webinar. For everybody else on the call who doesn't know me, my name is Thorsten Schluppmann. I'm working for USD since 2011, and within our audit department, I'm responsible for all PCI relevant and related certifications, assessments, and besides PCI DSS, I'm also accredited from the PCI Council to perform software assessments, so PA DSS, as well as the Software Security Framework, which is the successor standard of the PA DSS.
Yes, hi everyone, my name is Ben Brohr. I'm also happy to here to present you the most relevant changes that coming up to with the PCI 4.0. Yes, I'm as well a PCI DSS auditor, so maybe you have recognized me in some of the assessments in the last years. Additionally, I'm currently more and more evolving our further audit options. Let's call it like that. It's first of all the cybersecurity check, which is basically a check against best practices that is not regulated by any other, for example, PCI DSS regulations. And as well, I'm doing some audits for the BSI CRITIS, it's for critical infrastructures in Germany, but I think also the European law, the NIS, is also relevant in that topic. But today we will focus on PCI DSS 4.0. And Thorsten already mentioned our presentation will last 45 to 50 minutes. At the end, you have the possibility to ask questions. Of course, you can ask questions all the time. Maybe if you're fast enough and we get it right away, we can answer it directly while staying at the topic. If not, we will answer them in the end of the talk. You do not, or one more hint, you do not have to take any notes with you. The presentation slides will be forwarded to you, as well as this talk will also be provided via YouTube or via our YouTube channel. So if you want to see us again, you have the possibility over there. And now let's get started with the topic. Thorsten, I think you can start with the agenda.
Okay. Thanks. So before we get into the details, a brief look at our agenda for today's meeting. First of all, we want to start with the high-level goals, the motivation of the new release of the PCI DSS. Afterwards, we want to talk about timelines and milestones. Want to see how the development of 4.0 was in the past years, and also how the near future will look like with regards to transition from version 3.2.1 to 4.0. Afterwards, we want to give an overview of the requirements and assessment procedures, as well as the reporting documents. There were no significant changes to the documents or the process in general, so we still have the ROC, the report on compliance, and the associated or corresponding AOC, attestation of compliance. So the documents are still in place, and the reporting processes to the credit card organizations, for example, won't change as well. But within those documents, there are also some significant changes that we want to highlight as well. Afterwards, we want to talk about the validation approaches because the PCI Council has introduced the so-called customized validation approach, which provides some more flexibility how requirements can be met, how controls can be implemented, and how the implementation can be verified in the end by the assessors. Afterwards, we want to give an overview of the changes. So what kind of categories are there for the different changes that were introduced? How many changes? When do which changes need to be implemented? And afterwards, in the last chapter for today's webinar, we want to talk about a couple of selected requirements, evolving requirements that were implemented that should be considered with high priority from our point of view. Okay, so let's start with the high-level goals of PCI DSS 4.0. The overall goal, of course, was to address evolving risk and threats to payment data and corresponding environments, because it was about time. The last major change for PCI DSS was released in 2013. So 9 years ago, the version 3.0 was released, and afterwards we only had a couple of minor updates, adjustments to the standard. So version 3.1, 3.2, and 3.2.1. So overall, even if the standard was always independent from technology and tools, definitely there were some major changes within the last 9 years. For example, cloud environments or microservices are getting more and more popular. And with the quite old standard from 2013 and with the strict requirements, it was quite hard to actually meet all the requirements with those new technologies and tools that weren't there when PCI 3.0 was developed and released in 2013. So there were different changes with regards to the requirement, but as I highlighted out on the agenda slide, also with the customized approach where really you have the possibility to address the requirements in a way that does not follow the strict requirements as well as testing procedures that we know from the previous versions of the PCI DSS assessments. Further, the PCI 4.0 provides some flexibility to integrate the PCI DSS controls in already existing management systems or control frameworks. So, for example, SOC controls, SOC assessments, ISO assessments. In the past, because the PCI standard was always that strict with regards to the requirements and how they should be met by implementing controls, PCI was always some dedicated solution environment as it was not compatible, let's say that way, to controls that were already in place to meet requirements of other security standards. So this is definitely a big improvement that's coming up with PCI 4.0. And further, another goal is to promote security as a continuous process and to integrate it as really business as usual. So there were already some changes in the past, but with 4.0, there are additional changes regarding this business as usual. Security should be integrated in the day-to-day activities. And one example is that companies need to verify and document the results of their, so they need to verify their scope on at least an annual basis and after significant changes, and those results of the internal scope verification need to be documented and provided to the assessor as part of the annual PCI DSS assessment. Okay. With regards to the development timeline, I don't really want to focus on the past, but just wanted to give you an impression how the development of the 4.0 standard looked like. There were 3 requests for comment phases in total, where, for example, we as a Qsa company, as well as the participating organizations, were directly involved in the development of the standard. So there were different draft versions, and we and the industry were able to provide feedback, and the development was really driven by industry feedback. There's really a good approach that was followed for the 4.0, so that really feedback from the stakeholders who need to work with the PCI in the end, the companies that need to implement it, and the assessors that need to validate the implementations were really and directly involved in the development of the standard. That's really a good thing from my point of view. In the beginning of this year, in January, there was the so-called Stakeholder Preview, which I would like to describe as a final draft, so to say, that the Qsa companies, participating organizations, had a couple of months to review the final standard, to prepare accordingly, and then about 5 or 6 weeks ago, at the end of March, the final version was released to the public. Afterwards, I think again 4 weeks later, at the end of April, the so-called SAQs were released, the self-assessment questionnaires. So those are still in place to provide the possibility to self-assess and self-report PCI DSS compliance for smaller merchants or service providers that that are eligible for each of those SAQs. Another thing I want to highlight or point out is here the Qsa training, which is coming up in June, because each and every Qsa needs to perform and take specific transition training for the new version of PCI DSS. So if you want to engage in Qsa for your first PCI 4.0 assessment, make sure that he's capable and accredited by the PCI Council to perform this assessment. This is something that will be published on the PCI Council's website, so pcissc.org. You can then look up if your Qsa already took the 4.0 transition training, and to see if he is allowed to perform the 4.0 assessment as well. So this is also a new thing that wasn't there in the past for previous versions of the DSS. And in June, the PCI Council will publish additional documentation, guidance documents, FAQs that should help clearly you on the customer side to understand the different and new requirements, as well as for the auditors, for the assessors, that they understand the new requirements and how assessments should be performed in the future. Overall, there were over 6,000 feedback items from 2,000 unique companies that were gathered during those 3 requests for comment phases I just mentioned. So you can see there were really a lot of participation, which in the end led to the final version of the 4.0 that was released at the end of March. Okay, for everybody that is has some kind of PCI responsibilities within your companies, you're probably wondering, when do I need to fulfill the new standards? When do I have to implement controls to meet the new standards? And this is something we want to highlight here on the slide as the transition timeline. The good thing is, you see here at the end of March in 2024, so more about 2 years until the PCI 3.2.1 retires. So until the end of March 2024, you are still allowed to perform assessments to PCI 3.2.1. And clearly, in parallel, it is also possible to do a 4.0 assessment. With the run note I already dropped, that the QSA must be, or must have passed the corresponding transition training for 4.0. So quite long time where you can choose if you want to be certified against 3.2.1 or 4.0. And there are a couple of requirements that are effective immediately for all PCI DSS 4.0 assessments, which we will highlight or point out a little bit later within this webinar. And then there are also so-called future date requirements, like in the past. And for this requirement, you have an additional year to implement those requirements or implement controls that will meet those requirements. And those are considered as best practices until the end of March 2025. So beginning in April 2025, this is the time where all requirements need to be fully implemented. Of course, only if they are applicable to you and your environment, but there all requirements need to be implemented. And beginning in April 2024, all assessments need to be conducted against the new version of the standard, the 4.0. And with those relatively long transition times, I would hand over to Vincent. Maybe you can tell us a little bit, what is your opinion on the further activities when someone should start considering the changes, planning gap analysis, or planning even the first 4.0 assessment?
That's a really good question. So first of all, I would like to point out to that question when to move and when to perform the transition, when you will actually be certified against the 4.0. And I think it's no need to rush to it. So the PCI 3.2.1 is still valid. There's no, from compliance perspective, there's no benefit in moving today or even this year to the 4.0 standard. Maybe you can, or maybe you see some commercial benefit in moving to that, but from the compliance perspective, there's no really benefit. Having that said, I would recommend, if you haven't got your assessment in the first half of the year, so already done, I would recommend to perform a gap analysis in the second half of the year to just know the critical requirements that you need to address. However, I would also recommend to perform the assessment in 2023, also against the old standard, so to say, as you're pretty sure that you can make it. Additionally, at least we as assessors offer gap analysis as part of the assessment. So we will cover both requirements as well from the old standard as well as from the new standard. However, you have to choose prior to the assessment, which is the baseline against you will get the certification. So there's it's not a good idea to start with doing the 4.0 thing and then recognize, oh, this will not happen this year. Let's switch back to the 3.2.1. That's a really hard and confusing thing. Being that said, I would not recommend it. We have to choose prior to the assessment which standards we have to go. In the end, if you go with our preferred way, having the 3.2.1 assessment with a gap analysis as a combination, in the end you have all the topics that you have to address, and that you have still 1 year time to address it technically and implement it, everything until you get certified against the new standard. Additionally, we will see on the next slide that there's a huge difference between the sunset date, so the date in 2024, and the date in 2025. So the requirements will increase a lot by that. Talking about requirements, of course, it's interesting how do they have changed with the new standard, and I think they have changed a lot, and I think they have changed to the better. So now it's really clear if you take three different portions of the new requirement structure. So first of all, the requirement, of course, is really important, as it says what you have to implement or what you have to do. But with the customized approach objective as well as the purpose on the right side, you have two additional really helpful fields and comments that will give us by the new standard. So first of all, the requirement, you have to fulfill it, but with the objective, you have the goal, and with the purpose, you have the reason why you should fulfill the goal. So that's three really important topics and fields, and I think it's really good that they have been implemented. Additionally, of course, we have not only the requirement that must be fulfilled, but also the applicability notes. So in here, the PCI Council gives us some further expressions and some further guidance on which kinds of systems, applications, processes, etc. are the requirement to be applicable to. So I think with this 4 fields, it's really helpful. Of course, there are a lot of other fields for good practice, for example, how to implement it, or the definitions are in some of the parts just give you some definitions on, in that case, remote access technology. What is that meant by? Additionally, in the end of the PCI, in the appendix, there's also a glossary. I think it's also worth to look at that, but it's not directly part of the requirement, just as a hint on that side. However, we have the requirements. The next important part is the reporting documents. The AOC, ALC have changed as well. I think there are some significant changes, not only for good, but only maybe will increase the discussions with your assessor. In particular, the first one in the AOC, there's not only the place button like it was in the past, but there's an additional button which is called in place with remediation. So the idea behind that is to look at other standards who have a hint of how good the company has passed and how many remediations they have to. Nevertheless, the PCI DSS still remains a 100% standard, so it's not the idea to have in place with remediation, but the remediation was not performed yet, so it has already been to be performed before the certification. The next important part is covered the last 2 years. I think most of you have performed remote assessments during the pandemic, and as this potentially will not go backwards and everything will be performed back on site, it was documented or to be documented what assessments or what assessment activities were performed remote and what activities are to be performed on site. Important on that part is that the remote assessment guideline details that a little bit more, and we have to define, and that's the documentation part in the work, why we have the testing was not feasible, so why the testing was not feasible or practical to perform on site. This gives a little bit of a hint that the council will stay with the topic that we have to go on site and visit you at your company's locations. But there's a little bit more flexibility here. in the end, the reporting instructions are a little bit less. So in the past, we have to write in every sub-requirement what we have seen or noticed. Now it's more reliance on the evidence. However, in the beginning, I don't assume that that will decrease the reporting effort on our side. Maybe in the future, when we align more on each other and you provided the evidences, or the companies provide the evidences in the really structured way, it may be possible that the effort will decrease, but maybe it will stay the same. So we have to have the experience on that topic in the end. Having that said, one of the important part of this new assessment or the new report on compliance is the in place with remediation. And there the question is, of course, is a remediation or is a finding still the same as in the old standard? Maybe can you give us some insights to that, Thorsten?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we don't have a final answer right now as of today. Yeah, as Vincent pointed out, in the ROC, in the report on compliance, that probably will stay internal with your company, but as well in the attestation of compliance with, yeah, and this document may be shared with other relevant stakeholders, third-party providers, customers of yours. It is also indicated if the requirement was in place or in place with remediation. And I assume nobody wants to have a lot of check marks with the in place with the remediation column. And it's really yeah, still open topic to see if the council will provide further guidance on this topic, because right now there's only a finding. If you don't have the PCI requirement in place, it's a finding, and the PCI Council right now does not make any difference if your security policy wasn't reviewed within 1 year, what is required, or if you store any kind of plaintext pans on your data, if you have some minor misconfigured network security control, or you even store sensitive authentication data after authorization. In the end, right now, it's all a finding. And what is interesting and what we are really looking for, which will probably be communicated within June, what I said earlier, with the supporting documentations that are going to be released, or the upcoming Qsa transition training for 4.0. Hopefully we will get some clarification, and maybe they will introduce something, yeah, that we have some kind of classification for the findings, like we yeah, already know it from other security standards, ISO certification assessments, for example, that we have a classification of major and minor findings, for example. But right now, yeah, unfortunately, we don't have an answer to this. But yeah, this is really something that is going to be interesting for you as a company, as well as for the us as assessors for the upcoming 4.0 assessments. Okay, now I want to talk about the validation approaches. In the past, until now, we only had one defined, and it is called defined approach in 4.0, where the council strictly said how a requirement needs to be implemented and how the assessor had to validate the implementation. So the defined approach, as I said, is like what we have basically right now in 3.2.1, the traditional method for implementing and validating PCI requirements. And for you as a customer, it provides direct guidance and instructions how to implement the requirements, as well as for the assessor side, it says how it must be tested, verified that the control for the requirement is in place, so that the requirement is met in the end. And it may be the right approach for already certified organizations or organizations that have established security controls in place, that maybe need more direction and information how something should be implemented. And from our side, there's no need to directly go with the customized approach. So the customized approach is on the other side a possibility for companies to address requirements, but there's absolutely no need if you are already certified to move from the defined approach to the customized approach, because the customized approach, it really focuses on the objective of each requirement, and there's nothing from PCI Council defined how you have to implement something. So obviously it then provides greater flexibility in the implementation, and companies really can design and implement controls unique to their organization, and maybe what I mentioned in the beginning, can adopt to controls that are already there for other security certifications, management systems, and so on. In the past, it was really quite difficult, from my opinion, because the PCI was so strict how something should be or must be implemented. And for those companies, the customized approach is really a good thing from my point of view.
One question that comes to my mind, and that constrains the compensating controls here, standing if my organization is already certified having compensating controls in place, can I use them further in my next certifications also with 4.0?
Yes, the compensating controls remain in place, but only for the defined approach. And this is something, the compensating control was removed during the different RFC phases I mentioned on the first slide. But in the end, it was reintroduced back again to the standard. And even if you have compensating controls in place right now, you don't have to switch to the customized approach. You can stick with your compensating controls, and in the end, the requirements for using compensating control remain the same. So it's only possible in case there's a technical or business constraint that does not allow that the requirement can be met as explicitly mentioned by the standard. And obviously the compensating control must mitigate the risk with the affected requirement, and you still have to document it, and this will be validated and reported as part of the report on compliance by your assessor within the compensating control worksheet. So basically everything will stay in place like we know it from the previous assessments. As I said, the defined approach uses requirements and testing procedures as documented and requested by the council within the standard, and the assessor follows the defined testing procedures to verify that the requirement has been met. On the other side, the customized approach, it's really the goal or to provide entities, organizations, the possibility to design and implement controls unique to their specific requirement. So controls should be implemented in a way that meet the customized approach objective in a way that does not strictly follow the requirement as within the defined approach. One interesting note is, as there are no predefined controls for this customized approach. There are also no predefined testing procedures for the assessors. So in the end, it's the assessor has to derive and document appropriate testing procedures based on your control that has been implemented as part of the customized approach. So it's really a unique control that is implemented, and also unique testing procedures that are appropriate for the corresponding control. Not all requirements are eligible for the customized approach. So, for example, the storage of sensitive authentication data or the usage of ASVs, approved scanning vendors, for your external vulnerability scans. There's no plan B, so to say. You have to stick there with the defined approach, the defined requirements, and this is directly and clearly documented and highlighted in the standard which requirements not eligible for the customized approach. Okay, I think I already mentioned that the compensating controls cannot be used as part of the customized approach because the Council expects that the controls meet or even exceed the security provided by the requirement in the defined approach. So the Council does not need does not see that any alternative or compensating control needs or should be implemented as part of the customized approach, because the control should already meet or even exceed the requirement as part of the defined approach. As I said, increased efforts for documentation and validation. This is definitely something that should be considered, because you as a company has to perform a targeted risk analysis for each and every requirement that you want to meet following the customized approach. And as I said earlier, the assessor then has to derive testing procedures, document them as part of the ROC, and obviously test and document the result from his testing. And in the end, it's really more intended for organizations that have a dedicated risk management department, that are risk mature, because it's really something where you need to understand the objective of the customized approach in order to be able to define and implement controls that are appropriate to address the corresponding requirement.
Okay, that sounds really interesting, and I think we have something that we can looking forward to. But first of all, some other overview of changes. So basically, there are 3 types of changes that are coming with 4.0. I think the most important part is the evolving requirement, which are really new requirements that were not present in the old standard. Some of them are structure and format changes. I think that's more on our side, to just have to remember new numbering, a little bit hard. But the third part, or the third part of changes, is clarification or guidance. I think the evolving requirements are the most important part, but nevertheless, also in the clarifications can be huge changes included. Just to give you one example, the Appendix A previously was only mentioned to shared hosting provider, so really small type of providers or third-party providers, and are now referred to multi-tenant host provider. And the applicability notes goes from infrastructure, application providing databases. So everything basically your customer uses the same infrastructure are mentioned as a shared or multi-tenant hosting provider. So the applicability increases a lot, but that for the Council only a clarification at that end. So we have to read it carefully, and maybe we find some other things that we are not yet aware of. The types of changes, I think most important, applicability. Most of the new requirements are applicable to all organizations, so to merchant as well as to service providers. Only 11 are for the service providers only. From the effective date, I think it's a good news that with the start in 2024, you only have to implement 13 new requirements. Out of that 13 requirements, 12 are for everybody. One is only for service providers, so we have a slight differentiation between service providers and merchants. However, I think the good news is, and that's what I would recommend to focus you in the beginning, to get the clarifications and guidance changes, as well as the 13 new requirements that are applicable with 4.0, with the 2024 deadline. In the end, some also good news: recurring activities, frequencies, and time frames are now more defined. So in the end, in the old standard, there was mentioned sometimes quarterly, sometimes every 6 months, sometimes 3 months. Now it's really clear what it meant to be. So for example, with monthly, there is from 29 to 32 days. It is specified. So maybe you have a short month, maybe there's a long month when you perform the recurring activity every time on the 1st or 6th or 10th of a month. So that's up to you. You are compliant regardless of the number of days a month has. I think that's a good clarification at that end. Additionally, there's a lot of different time frames that could be chosen or could be more or less chosen by you. And here I would assume, and we would assume, that the same holds true. So when you here tell also you do it monthly, also okay to do it at the sense of each month to stay compliant. That's it from the global overview part. I think you're really curious what are the actual requirements that have changed, and I already told you that there are 13 new requirements to be applicable as of 2024. So I think we will present it, or Torsten will present it right away.
Yep, absolutely. So those are basically all requirements, all 13 evolving requirements that are effective immediately for your first assessment according to the 4.0 standard, of course. On the first thing, we have the targeted risk analysis. I already mentioned when I talked about the customized approach. So every requirement that you will implement following the customized approach, you will need to perform and document a targeted risk analysis on an annual basis. Further, we have from requirement 2 to 11 the addition of a requirement with regards to roles and responsibilities for performing activities in the certain requirements. So those need to be documented, assigned, and understood, because in the past there was always, or not always, but sometimes some miscommunication. And I think one good example is the vulnerability scans that need to be performed at least on a quarterly basis. That one team is responsible for scanning the assets that are provided. Afterwards, they provide the results to the responsible teams that are responsible for the administration of the operating systems or network devices, for example. And then those team would be responsible for the remediation, but in the end, the results were handed over to the team, but nothing happened with the results because the roles and responsibilities were not clarified, not assigned, or not understood by the responsible teams. And this is something that the PCI Council wants to highlight by introduction of those requirements. And to add here within requirement 1, we have this requirement as well, but it was not classified as evolving requirement, but only as clarification, because for the network stuff there was already a requirement where documentation for groups and related responsibilities was required. So in the end, we have the roles and responsibility requirement in all requirements of 4.0. Further, the scope needs to be documented and confirmed. I already talked about that in the beginning, at least once every 12 months and after significant changes. Definitely to ensure that the scope is always accurate and that the, for example, credit card data is not somewhere out of the defined cardholder data environment. This is something that should be enforced by triggering or requiring regular scope verifications. And for service providers, beginning with April 2025, this even has to be done on a 6-month basis. So every 6 months, the scope needs to be verified and documented. And the last requirement that is effective immediately for all PCI DSS assessment does only apply to third-party service providers. And the requirement 12.9.2 should basically only help their clients to ensure or fulfill their requirements when it comes to service provider handling, that they need to confirm on an annual basis that the service provider is still PCI DSS compliant, and as well as the documentation of the responsibilities, so that it is clear and documented which requirements are in responsibility of the customer, which are in responsibility of the service provider, and where there might be even shared responsibility in place. And this requirement on the service provider side should make the life a little bit more easier for the merchants to get those informations that are required as part of their annual PCI DSS assessment.
So we can say the good news is if you only look at the first 13 requirements, I think they are not so hard to achieve, 10 times the same. If you do not a customized approach, the 11th is not relevant to you. Yes, I think it's a good starting point at that end. So, however, the risk assessment or risk management is slightly more detailed than in the old standard. In the old standard, it was basically mentioned, do a risk analysis and do it according to STEM standard. Now it's much more detailed. So first of all, the customized approach Thorsten already outlined. Second of all, you need to perform a risk analysis for every requirement where you can choose the frequency. So we already mentioned at some points you can choose some frequency. Just one more example. You have also to do the risk assessment or the frequency chosen for the file integrity monitoring, for example. And if you do that, and you basically have to do that, you have to perform a risk assessment. And it's also a good idea to have more details on what should be part of the risk assessment. So what information do you have to include into the assessment? There was at first the threats, of course, that are required or that requiring the protected is against, and as well the factors for the likelihood or impact that this threat will come or materializes must be documented, and according to that you need to have a detailed analysis on how to get at that times the frequency of performing some of the actions or the requirements. So in the end, I think it's good. In the past, I have been a lot in some pre-assessment and gap analysis sessions where customers of mine say, yes, we performed some risk analysis, but what is it about in the end? What should we do? I think with the clarification and the more details, it should be much more easier for us as well as for the clients how to proceed with that. One of the last points on that slide is the risk analysis for vulnerability scans. And I think as we have the vulnerability scans on the next slides and more detail, I hand over to Thorsten, who will give you some insights to that.
Yeah, vulnerability management or specifically the vulnerability scanning will remain in place overall, and yeah, specifically for the internal vulnerability scans, there are some significant changes that I want to highlight on this slide. The frequency still every 3 months and after significant changes. So this, yeah, there's basically no change. What does change is the mode, because within PCI 4.0, authenticated scanning is required, at least for the internal vulnerability scans. So authenticated scanning with the credentials to the corresponding operating system, network security control, definitely provides greater insight into your vulnerability landscape because it can clearly detect more vulnerabilities than an unauthenticated scans that yeah, basically look at the outside of the system, open ports, watch what services, applications are running on the system. So this is definitely something that has an impact as part of the 4.0 release. Further, what I've changed is the remediation. So in the end, on the 3.2.1 standard, it was required that all high-risk vulnerabilities are remediated, and yeah, this is confirmed by successful rescans that show that the remediation was successful. This basically stays. The rescans are still required for high risk and critical vulnerabilities, but you have to address all vulnerabilities that were identified as part of the vulnerability scan. So even again, depending on your classification, but for example, vulnerabilities classified as low or medium, this is something that must be addressed and handled, by you with the upcoming 4.0 assessment. So this is definitely a huge change, and yeah, all vulnerabilities must be managed according to the risk analysis that Vincent yeah, pointed out on the previous slide. Further, as we talked about the authenticated scans, clearly your scanner appliance needs the corresponding credentials to be able to log in to authenticate to the system. So this is definitely something that should be considered as highly privileged, and therefore those requirements or the corresponding technical accounts need to be handled according to a couple of new requirements that were introduced or are being introduced of the 4.0, and this is something that Vincent will highlight on the next slide.
Yes, thank you. So for the technical accounts, you already mentioned vulnerability scans most probably have really high privileges, but they should be as much limited as possible. So as much as needed, of course, but as limited as possible. And this is a completely new requirement in the 4.0. I think it's a good start to get to know every technical account you have in place in your environment. I think that's a quite hard topic for some organizations, but these kinds of accounts come more into focus. As well, to the limitation, you also have to review the access and the permissions of these kinds of technical accounts and you have to do that periodically. And one hint to everybody, periodically means you have to perform a risk analysis on how often you will perform that. As well, you have to change the passwords periodically, which also means you have to choose. If you take a really long password for the technical account, you can yes, maybe more less. But in the end, more interesting or even more interesting are accounts or technical accounts that can be used with an interactive login. So, for example, if you have an SSH user on your Linux machine, this is definitely one that can be used as an interactive user login. And for these kinds of accounts, even more requirements come into play. So first of all, of course, you need to have some technical measures to prevent that anybody else in the technical machine or system is logging into that. First of all, and I think that's also a really, really hard topic, is if you have such technical user accounts and an interactive account, if interactive login is possible, then that means that the password of that account is not allowed to store it in any configuration or scripting files. So I think that it's really a really, really tough requirement. Just thinking about any database access that might be used as an interactive login, and you do not have to, or you are not further allowed to store it in some scripts or configuration files. I think that's a really hard one, and I would really say that you should address the topic of technical accounts and technical user handling on a really first level, and to be ready to at least 2025.
Okay, then let's talk about access to PANs. There were already also some changes. So there were always in the past requirement that restricted direct user access to databases containing credit card data, and this is evolved that it does not only apply to databases, but basically all cardholder data repositories, so all repositories where cardholder is stored, and this should be restricted, the user access via applications or other programmatic methods. Direct access obviously should only be possible for the responsible administrator, so for example the DBA. Further, within requirement 12, there was always the requirement that only personnel with the business need should be allowed to copy PANs via remote technologies. This was always only a policy requirement in the past. With PCI 4.0, it is required that you additionally implement some technical controls that enforce this requirement. So technically prevent all other personnel that don't have a business need to do this from copying PANs via remote technologies.
Okay, the next one is also in two terms really interesting. But before I will present it, just a short reminder: we have 2 minutes to go. Luckily, we were able to answer all questions that coming into our chat during the slideshow. But if you have questions, I think it's a good time to type it in, and we take our time and go into overtime, just to let you know to answer your questions if you have any further. However, disk level encryption is only allowed for removable media, which means it's not allowed anymore for any other type of media. Removable media is defined as, for example, USB sticks. So if you have implemented it in any way, person or any other way, it's not yet allowed anymore. And here are two further topics that in the clarifications and definitions are really heavy changes as well. So RAM disks are no longer considered volatile media. That means that if you have used some RAM disk to do not store credit card data only in RAM and not on the hard disk, this is not long or maybe not longer applicable, and you have also to encrypt these data. And as well, the temporary storage of clear text PANs may be compliant. That is really surprising in our terms. We are a little bit not yet sure, and we have asked that for clarification on that end. I think it's interesting in the end, but you see this the correct statement right away from the standard. The requirement does not preclude the use of temporary files containing clear text files while encrypting and decrypting. So it's clear that's only during that short process allowed. However, it seems to be allowed with the new standard.
Okay, one more slide from our side with regards to storage of paths, more concrete hashing of paths. In PCI 3.2.1, there was only the requirement that the entire path must be hashed, one-way hashes based on strong cryptography. So there were no other requirement, only some recommendation that salts should be used, especially if you store the hashed as well as the truncated version of the same pan, because then it would be relatively easy to reconstruct the full pan. And within 4.0 PCI, the PCI goes one step ahead and requires that hashes used to render paths unreadable are keyed cryptographic hashes. So, for example, that HMAC, CMAC, or GMAC is used to hash the data, and you don't have to only change your hashing algorithm. I think the next requirement is even more harder or complicated to meet, is that the secret key that is used of the key cryptographic hash function is handled according to PCI DSS requirement 3.6, 3.7, which requires defined key management processes and procedures. So everybody that stores encrypted cardholder data is already familiar with those requirements, and it addresses, for example, the generation of the secret key, a crypto period needs to be in place, and how, for example, the key can be changed after the crypto period has been exceeded.
Okay, the last topic we want to present is the payment pages. In the past, as a merchant, if you use the payment page from a third-party service provider, which is PCI certified, you are fine and you can choose it. In the future, you have to do something more. So at least you have to be aware of every script that in the payment page is running. So the scripts need to be authorized. The integrity of each script need to be assured, and you need to have an inventory of all the scripts that are maintained with a justification why they are included in the payment page. So that's a really hard new requirement, and this is also applicable to any merchant. So if you're ready to go to choose with the SAQA, for example, with this a really limited scope, or worse than a really limited scope, you have to also perform and comply with the requirements right away from the start of PCI 4.0. As well, when it meant to have assure the integrity of the script, there are some more further technical guidance in requirement 11.6.1. So you need to have some kind of change in temper detection mechanism to check if HTTP headers and the contents of the payment page is still the same, or does it have changed in any way. So just from a wording perspective, file integrity monitoring is now worded as change in temper detection. So you have pretty much the requirement to have a file integrity monitoring in their old wording for their payment page content. And having that said, I really want to thank you for your interest that you have joined today our call. I think it was a straight overview of all the changes of hard requirements. Of course, it's not all covered by or within that hour. There are a lot much to find in the PCI 4.0, a lot much to learn. I think we get some more supporting documentation. Qsa training I'm looking forward to yes, in the next week, in the next month, sorry, and yes, I think it's interesting times that are coming in front of us.
Okay, yeah, thanks everyone for your time and joining. I also hope that you've got a good overview of the new requirement, the changes. Yeah, as you have probably seen, there's a lot going on, so we were not able to cover everything within this 1 hour webinar. So if you have any question coming up after the afterwards, feel free to reach out. Our contact details will be included in the PDF version of the slide deck that we will provide afterwards. And further, I want to highlight 2 more webinars that are coming up that are free, as well as this webinar today. And they are also focusing on PCI DSS, but on a more specific scope, so to say. On the 21st of July, there's a webinar with the focus on e-commerce, so impact of PCI 4.0 and corresponding changes on e-commerce, again in German as well as English. And a little bit later within this year, on the 23rd of August, we will do the same, again, PCI DSS 4.0, but this time we will focus on the stationary credit card handling, so on retailers, and point of sale. So if you are interested in the e-commerce, retail, or even both topics, feel free to register to those webinars. And as I said, feel free to reach out in case of any questions. And if you don't want to miss any of our upcoming webinars or news that we post on our website, feel free to look up our event calendar on the CST Academy side, as well as follow us on the different social media that is listed here on the slide. And thanks again for joining. Have a nice day, have a nice evening, depending on your time zone. Take care, and hopefully talk to you soon. Thank you.